Good afternoon from London. It is a bright, pleasant afternoon here, not too hot but pleasantly warm. And hello from me, Dr. Dermot Hudson, Chairman of the British Group for the Study of the Juche Idea, Chairman of the UK Korean Friendship Association, an official delegate of the Korean Friendship Association for the UK, and President of the Association for the Study of Songun Politics. I'm here today to speak about what may be, for some, a rather thorny, tricky, controversial and difficult subject. That is hostility on the left to people's career and the Juche Idea. And I would draw your attention to an article published by the Korean Friendship Association many years ago called When Friends Become Enemies, Understanding Left-Wing Hostility to the DPRK, and my own article, Refutation of the Leftist Critics of Juche, which I published about a week ago. And a few days ago I made a video about why the mainstream media are so hostile to people's career, and that I think was well received. And it's a fact that unfortunately the hostility of the mainstream media, its demonisation and vilification of people's career, has echoes on the left, albeit sometimes faint echoes, or an indifference towards defending people's career. And of course there are a number of organisations which are honourable exceptions to this, which I will not mention here because it would be seen as endorsing every dot and comma of those particular organisations. But some organisations have stood in defence of people's career, which is absolutely great. And of course I would in no way tar the entire left with the same brush, and indeed the left is a term which actually covers quite a wide spectrum of opinion. And indeed, when I was a kid, I was given by my mother for my birthday a book called A Dictionary of Politics, edited by Walter Liqueur, which described the left as representing a diverse range of opinion, from Attlee's Labour Party in the German SPD to Chairman Mao's Red Guards and the New Left. And I think that certainly sort of sums up the self-defined left. Of course, many who style themselves left-wing are in fact basically liberals, and it's these kind of people are often the first to buy into imperialist propaganda against the DPRK over human rights, and often parrot it, unfortunately. And of course I think people who do on the left who do take sort of hostile attitudes towards people's career have got to realise all they're doing is the dirty work of the BBC, CNN, Daily Mail for them. They're conniving at these kind of attacks on people's career. And it's a fact that some people have occasionally invoked the British anti-communist writer George Orwell, real name Eric Blair, which I think just about sums it up, in their attacks on people's career. And Orwell wrote very cheap and trashy anti-communist propaganda works, 1984 and Animal Farm, the rights of which were bought by the US Central Intelligence Agency so it could use it as propaganda against the socialist countries and against the communist movement in general. What is perhaps less well known about Orwell was that he was actually an informer for the British state, an anti-communist McCarthyite who handed over lists of suspected communists and communist sympathisers to British intelligence and was quite enthusiastic to do so. And if you actually read the other works of George Orwell, such as The Road to Wigan Pier, you will realise that in fact he had quite a lot of hostility towards the working class, and even pokes fun at the left as well. And some people allege that even during the Spanish Civil War that Orwell was actually working for MI6, the British Overseas Intelligence Service. And lastly, on the subject of Orwell, he was a strong anti-Irish racist who had a personal vendetta against the great Irish playwright Sean O'Casey. Moving on, there's sort of question of the ideology of Trotskyism, neo-Trotskyism and quasi-Trotskyism on the left, particularly in Britain, which I think actually generates a fair amount of hostility to the DPRK on the left. And these kind of people, Trotskyites, tend to foam at the mouth if you mention independence, and they have a particular phobia about so-called nationalism. And of course, Trotskyism rejects the idea of building a socialism in one country, which to me is basic common sense, that you try to build socialism within your own country, within the boundaries of a national unit. And the irony about Trotskyism, or at least British Trotskyism, was that in the 1980s the Trotskyites got control of Liverpool City, and instead of building socialism in one country, they tried to build socialism within the confines of one English city. And of course I would leave it to the people of Liverpool to judge the success or failure of that particular episode, but it illustrates the sort of hypocrisy and double standards of Trotskyism. Indeed, I think there's a whole issue within big countries of condemning what they call nationalism, when a small country like People's Korea stands up for itself. But the same kind of people do not see any problems with national chauvinism in big countries, but they take issue if the DPRK stands up for itself. They for instance condemn movements for Scottish independence, saying that nationalism is divisive, but they stand behind the nationalism of bigger countries. And in fact, I think a lot of so-called leftist hostility towards People's Korea does come from a wrong-headed concept that, a small country cannot produce a great ideology and is in some way inferior to big countries. And I think that theme runs through a lot of so-called leftist hostility to the DPRK, and you will notice that some some elements on the left, they take a very sort of disparaging, dismissive, and nitpicking attitude towards the DPRK, which they never took towards the Soviet Union when it existed, or to a big country like China. Some people will pick up a book from the DPRK, flick it open, and say, "Oh my God, look at that! Why have they written that? Oh dear! Oh, Mrs. Oh, they can't say that. Oh, without actually bothering to properly read the whole book." And that's just an example of the kind of thing, and the kind of difficulties that are created when we try to promote the Juche Idea and solidarity with the DPRK. And I think this is linked to a sort of deeper and a longer term issue of Flunkeyism. And what do we mean by Flunkeyism? Well, we mean the tendency to look up to and to worship big powers. Not just any foreign country, let's be clear about this, but big powers such as the former Soviet Union, such as China, but also the United States, Japan, Britain, France, and Germany, and other big countries. And it was very clear to me that this was an issue, with some people. And I remember in the early 1980s, around 1982, 1983, I started to become interested in people's career and was very curious about it. And I didn't know where I could find actually books from the DPRK. You could find one or two books, not so many books in general about the DPRK in those days, but they were actually quite hostile to it. They were written by people hostile to the DPRK. And I think one day, 1985, the Observer carried a very long article on the DPRK, which was quite hostile. It mentioned the Juche Idea, and I said to myself, I must really find out what the Juche Idea is. I must read the works of President Kim Il-sung. So I went to a meeting of the local Morning Star Readers and Supporters Group, and there was a couple of people from an extreme pro-Soviet group that's no longer around called the Proletarian Group. Don't get it confused with the current newspaper of that name. It's two different, totally different entities. And I said, I'm quite interested in finding out more about, people's career and the Juche Idea. I'd like to wonder where I could buy some works of President Kim Il-sung. And I was told, I could buy them in a second-hand bookshop in the back streets of Southampton. But he added, hope people won't mind me doing impersonation. Here he added, you don't want to read them, you want to read Novosti books. And of course, Novosti was the publishing house of the old Soviet Union. And it is a fact that today the Soviet Union no longer exists, but people's career, guided by the Juche Idea, guided by self-reliance, is prospering and thriving. And I think that fact stands testimony to the fallacy of these kind of theories that were advocated by some on the left. And it is a fact that it was very deep rooted, and in fact still is. And I remember how I'd become uneasy with certain aspects of the Soviet Union, such as the capitulation in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, various deals being done with the imperialists, SALT and detente and this kind of thing. And I remember really being shocked when I learnt that a Pepsi Cola factory had been constructed in the USSR. I thought, how on earth can a socialist country do a thing, allow such a thing? And when I tried to raise it with the pro-Sovietists, the so-called hardliners, they just dismissed it. To them, the Soviet Union was the ultimate hardline state, and there was no other model of socialism, according to them. And some people, again, there were honourable exceptions. They even supported the Soviet Union when Gorbachev was in power, and you had perestroika, and some of these people were shouting the praises of perestroika right up to the bitter end, which was quite absurd, really. And I think also another issue is the whole problem of dogmatism, the idea that the works of Marx and Lenin were simply not a guide to action, but some kind of eternal and fixed truth which cannot be changed or developed, and cannot be that you cannot go beyond those theories, even though most of them, these were actually worked out, in a lot of cases over 100 years ago, before, for instance, any socialist country existed. But some people like to treat these as something like a tablet of stone, or like the Bible. And the DPRK is unfairly criticised for abandoning Marxism, Leninism, quote unquote, and for developing Juche. And the fact was that in the 1950s, when the DPRK was building socialism, it faced a number of new challenges which were not covered in the textbooks of classical Marxism-Leninism. And the problem was, every time a new policy was advanced, various dogmatists, factionalists tried to say, oh no, you can't do this because it's not in the classics of Marxism, Leninism, or this has never been tried in a big country, so how can we do this? And this is why President Kim Il-sung launched the struggle to establish Juche, and it was quite a serious and sharp struggle. And in fact, he fought against Flunkeyism, Dogmatism, factionalism, and also modern revisionism, which had emerged in the international communist movement at the time. And it's a fact that today some people, regrettably, are sort of, they're sort of actually coming out with positions that were lost in the, which were lost and defeated in the DPRK in the 1950s. And it is a fact that by establishing Juche, the DPRK was able to industrialise and build a strong country able to stand on its own 2 feet. And it meant that it was able to defend socialism when others fell by the wayside. And I think many of the so-called leftist critics of the Juche idea should do well to remember this and always bear this in mind before they criticise Juche. And it's an important job of Juche idea followers and true friends of People's Career to defend People's Career against attacks from all sides. We stand right behind the DPRK. So to conclude this video, I would also recommend people read this short book from the DPRK, which is very good. You can actually find, I believe, PDFs online. So let's defend the People's Career with no ifs or buts. Thank you for watching this. Please subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and please look out for our online events, and hopefully when COVID-19 is finally over, we'll be holding some real life events. In the meantime, please stay safe. Have a good day. Goodbye.